So today we're going to be talking about the book of Revelation. Okay, and more specifically, we're going to go into the way that the book of Revelation has been viewed and understood historically. So the book of Revelation is a book that stirs up a lot of debate. It's very different from the rest of the books in the New Testament. It's completely different from everything else that's in there. And so because of that, it's had a tendency to kind of throw a wrench into the views that people have worked out. And so at times, that has caused kind of a dilemma for people trying to figure out, what to do with this book and how they should approach it. And so I want to dive into that a little bit, and I'm going to start off with talking about the authorship, who wrote the book, and why the book of Revelation is in the Bible to begin with. So why was it included in the canon? The book of Revelation is widely accepted as being written by the Apostle John, and Revelation itself states that it was written by John while on the Isle of Patmos. And so we could see that here. So in Revelation 1, in verses 1 through 2, it says, "The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave, and signified it by his angel unto his servant John, who bore record of the word of God and of the testimony of Jesus Christ and of all things that he saw." So this kind of points to the Apostle John, right? And then again in Revelation 1 and verse 9, he says, "I, John, who also am your brother and companion in tribulation, was in the isle that is called Patmos, for the word of God and for the testimony of Jesus Christ." And there are many other places throughout Revelation where the author identifies himself as being John. But if you need, as far as what other evidence do we have pointing to this being the Apostle John who wrote Revelation? So there are a number of what they might call church leaders. They refer to them as pre-Nicene fathers, who wrote in the time around the time when Revelation was written, either during or shortly after it was written. And they not only quote from the book of Revelation, showing that they believed it to be divinely inspired, but they also, as well, they attest to it having being written by the Apostle John. And so this is just a list of a few of those people. So we have Papias, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, and Tertullian and Clemens, and there you have some of the dates where they wrote, and you could see that it's close to the original time when Revelation was written. And so, while I don't consider any of these people to be authoritative necessarily, it does give us insight into the fact that there were people that lived around the time that Revelation was written or shortly after that believed that the book was in fact divinely inspired and that it was written by the Apostle John. And then the other thing about this is that during this time period, this early time period right after Revelation was written, you don't really have anyone saying otherwise. You don't really have anyone stating or doubting that it was the Apostle John that wrote it, or saying anything contrary and doubting the inspiration of the book of Revelation. That doesn't really happen until much later. And so once you start getting into the 3rd and 4th century, that's when you start seeing some of this pushback, and people start kind of viewing the book of Revelation a little bit differently. And so there was a gentleman by the name of Dionysius of Alexandria, and he comes along and he proposes this argument. He makes this argument where he says that, the writing style of the book of John, the Gospel of John, he says that, the style and the grammar of it is very sophisticated, whereas the grammar and the style of the book of Revelation, he says, it's not refined at all, and it has all of these grammatical errors. And so the argument that he makes is that it couldn't have been the Apostle John that wrote Revelation. And then as you go along a little bit further down in history, you have Eusebius, and he's known as a church historian. And he was very influenced by this argument that Dionysius made. And so he kind of doubts the inspiration of the book of Revelation as well. And then eventually you get down to the Council of Laodicea. This was a regional council, so it didn't include, all of the church leaders from around the world. It was a smaller council, but they came up with a list of books to include in the Bible, a list, a canon list, and they left out the book of Revelation. And so you see kind of this influence, and over time you kind of see that people are kind of, their attitude and their view of Revelation is kind of cooling. And there's a few others here. I won't spend too much time on them, but these are a few other what they consider to be influential writers that wrote towards the end of the 4th century. And they also seemed to kind of put Revelation off to the side. They didn't deal too much with it. And so like I mentioned, you kind of, over time you see this kind of this attitude where they kind of cool off on their feelings towards the book of Revelation. And so that's one of the things that we're going to continue to see as we go through this and we go through the history here. We're going to see that the views on Revelation, they kind of continuously change as we get to different periods of history. And so, as part of this, I kind of want to take a look at that. And I want to kind of take a look at the why behind that and understand, why that was. And so, just to quickly summarize what we've gone through to this point so far, initially, you have the early church, they accepted the book of Revelation wholeheartedly, and they had no issue with it. They believed it to be divinely inspired and written by the Apostle John. And, the early church really had no reason to doubt the book of Revelation, because they either knew John directly, or they knew of him secondhand through somebody else who maybe knew John directly and could attest to the fact that John had written the book of Revelation. And so, there's no reason for them to doubt it. And the other thing is that we know that the early church faced a lot of persecution. They were heavily persecuted. And that's one of the big themes that you see throughout the book of Revelation, the persecution of the church. And so the book really, it spoke to them. It dealt with a lot of the things that they themselves were experiencing firsthand, right? And so it was very pertinent to the early church. Revelation provided hope for them, because it told them, okay, yes, you're going to be dealing with this heavy persecution, but ultimately, God still has a purpose for this. Like, this is all part of God's plan, and He's working something out, and ultimately, He is still in control, and He is going to resolve this, right? So even though you're going through these terrible things, God is still there. So, the church viewed Revelation as speaking about their current state. It explained their persecution. And because they saw themselves in Revelation, and they saw that eventually Revelation does mention that, it tells them that Christ is coming back, they felt that Christ was coming back soon, he had told them that He was going to come back, So they believed that Christ would literally return, and that this was just around the corner at any moment now, right? So that was kind of the initial view of the book of Revelation. But like we saw eventually, there's kind of a change of heart. So, why did that start to change? What are some of the reasons behind that, right? So as the church began to become more Gentile in nature, it started being infiltrated by Greek philosophy and thought. You start seeing this debate that starts taking place between taking a literal approach to interpreting the Bible versus a more Greek allegorical approach to interpreting Scripture, where everything is kind of just spiritualized away. And the reason for this is that the Greek mind, it's rooted and heavily influenced by the Greek philosophy. And in Greek philosophy, you have this kind of dualism that existed. It's kind of like this wall of separation between the physical and the spiritual. And in their minds, the two don't interact in any way. And so they had this view where in their mind, anything physical is corrupted, right? And so they had this view of God where they put God almost like on a different plane from physical reality. And they, in their minds, God, a perfect, all-powerful God, would never bring himself down to interact on a physical level, right? That was just completely foreign to their mind. So because of that, because they viewed things this way, it impacted the way they looked at the Bible and the way they tried to interpret the Bible. And so they felt that, the Bible needed to be interpreted in this very allegorical way to kind of strip out all of the physical elements from it in order to make sense of it, right? In order to make sense of, how, because in their mind, when they see things about God dealing with humanity in certain ways, that didn't fit their mindset, right? And so Revelation was kind of at the heart of this debate of whether to take a literal approach to interpreting Scripture or to take this more allegorical approach. And that's the reason for that is that there were groups, right, that felt that the church had allowed itself to become like way too influenced by Greek philosophy, and that they had started to go overboard with this allegorical approach. And Revelation was actually one of the books that they would point to advocate for, backing off from this Greek way of looking at things. And the reason for that is, so those that took an allegorical approach to God, you see in Revelation, it doesn't really fit because in Revelation it talks about God coming to the earth, right, and ruling on earth. And that didn't compute at all with the way that they thought of things. They could never see God doing something like that, coming down to earth and ruling in a physical kingdom on earth. That made no sense. And the other thing was, so in a sense they thought it was too Jewish and too physical. But the other thing was that the way they saw things, they believed that the nation of Israel had been completely replaced by the church. And so in their mind, the physical promises that had been made to Israel in the Old Testament, those were all going to be fulfilled in a spiritual sense through the church, okay? And so, you see all of these, in the book of Revelation, you see these millennial prophecies being invoked in the Old Testament, so that didn't fit with their way of thinking. And also, Revelation talks about the 144,000, and it talks about the 12 tribes of Israel. And so that also didn't really fit with their mindset of Israel having been replaced, right, by the church. It's like, why are we talking about the 12 tribes of Israel here? So because of this, because of these various issues that didn't really fit with the way they looked at the Bible and the way they wanted to interpret the Bible, their solution, one of the solutions, we'll talk about some of the other solutions they came up with, but one of their solutions was essentially to cast doubt on the authorship of Revelation. And so they said, hey, well, this isn't actually written by John, and so therefore, it's not really divinely inspired, right? It's not really inspired, and maybe it shouldn't be part of the Bible. The other problem that they started running into that they wanted to deal with is that there were groups that were popping up that were trying to set dates based on Revelation, okay? And, this is a problem that we've seen come up from time to time, even in our day. There will be people from time to time that will pop up that will say, hey, the world is ending 2 years from now. the world is ending 6 months from now, or this certain thing is lining up, and so this is it, this is the end, right? And so it seems like this has been a problem forever, right? It's been a problem for a long time, because even back then you had this group called the Montanists, and the Montanists, they sold all of their possessions, and they moved to a city in western Turkey named Papuza. And they set up in a field in Papuza. They just camped out there, literally looking up to the sky and just waiting for New Jerusalem to come down from the sky at any moment, because they were convinced this is it, it's happening any second now. And so they sold everything, and they were just in this field saying, okay, New Jerusalem is coming down here right now. Eventually, the world kept going, and so they realized, okay, maybe it's not right now. Maybe it's a few months down the line. I'm sure it's still pretty soon. But we've got to move on with our lives, right? And so they settled down, and they built up and fortified that city, and they were there for a long period of time, actually. In Papuza, it was like centuries that they were settled in that city. But so because of this, because you have these groups kind of popping up and trying to use Revelation and causing these kinds of disruptions where people were quitting their jobs and quitting, not doing the things that they needed to do to progress in life, the church kind of also wanted to kind of push Revelation to the side, right? At least some in the church. The other thing that had a big impact was the Edict of Milan. So the Roman Emperor Constantine in 313 AD, he legalized the practice of Christianity throughout the Roman Empire. And so this had a huge impact, because now all of a sudden the church is not being persecuted anymore the way that it was in the past by the Roman Empire. And up until this point, the Roman Empire had been viewed as the beast in Revelation. And so now the beast is no longer really persecuting you, and Christ hasn't returned. So now, what do you do, right? The other problem that this created was that now you've got the Roman emperor meddling with the church. He's putting together ecumenical councils, and he's kind of looking over the shoulder of church leaders to see what they're doing. And you've got this book that essentially points to the Roman Empire as being the beast that needs to be opposed, and that eventually it's going to be destroyed, and a new kingdom is going to be set up in Jerusalem. And that has political implications, right? So there was some political pressure to kind of distance themselves from the book of Revelation as well. Now, despite all of that, it still did eventually gain acceptance by the majority. And the reason why it gained acceptance, one of the big reasons why it gained acceptance, was because there was a bigger issue that they wanted to squash. And that bigger issue was the divinity of Christ. And so the book of Revelation has what is called a high Christological view. And so what that means is that it makes it very clear that Jesus was not just an ordinary man, but that he was God and that he pre-existed. And so this is a sermon in and of itself, so I won't spend too much time on this, but just to show a few portions of the book of Revelation. So in Revelation 1, verse 1, it declares plainly that this is the revelation of Jesus Christ. So throughout the book, you have Jesus Christ himself speaking on many occasions. And so going down to verse 8, he says, I am the Alpha, and this is Jesus Christ speaking. He says, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the ending, says the Lord, which is and which was and which is to come, the Almighty. And so here you have Jesus not only declaring that he's the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the ending, but he says that he is and that he was and that he is to come. And then he declares himself as the Almighty. And so it's almost impossible to get a higher view of Christ than that, where he declares himself the Almighty. And if there's any doubt as to who's speaking here, it makes it pretty clear as you continue on with chapter 1, because, again, he refers to himself with this title, saying, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last. And then he refers to himself as the Son of Man. And we know that that is a title that Jesus took on for himself over and over again. It's recorded all throughout the Gospels of him calling himself the Son of Man. And if you go into the book of Daniel and you take a look at that phrase, the Son of Man, that in and of itself, him taking that title has huge implications as well. But if there was still any doubt, he makes it crystal clear here in verses 17 through 18, because he says, I am the first and the last, I am he that lives and was dead. And so this is something that can only apply to Jesus. Jesus is the only one who really fits all of these descriptions. Okay, so the other thing is as you continue on through the book of Revelation, as you read the book of Revelation and you continue on to about chapters 4 and 5, you will find that it pictures Jesus being worshipped the same way, worshipped and praised the same way that God the Father is worshipped and praised. And so because of this, right, eventually the majority did come to accept Revelation as a way to defend the divinity of Christ. On the flip side, those that denied the divinity of Christ also attempted to reject the book of Revelation and the authority of Revelation. And they also would tend to reject the Gospel of John as well, because the Gospel of John also has a very, what you would call a high Christological view. Okay, so now as far as when the book of Revelation was written, okay, pretty much everybody agrees that it was written in the first century. The main debate is when in the first century was it written. And there's pretty much two dates that get thrown out there. One is 95 AD, and the other one is an earlier date of 65 AD. And so we'll go through the arguments for those. So the first one we'll talk about is the 95 AD date. This is the later date, and that's during the reign of the Roman Emperor Domitian. The arguments that get made to support this date is that there's a quote from Irenaeus from around 180 AD, where he seems to say that John wrote the book of Revelation during the reign of Domitian around 95 AD. And that gets debated. There are some who will say, no, he was actually saying something else, but I won't get into all the details of that. But that's one of the reasons that they put forth for this date. The other thing is that we know that during the reign of Domitian, that there was persecution of Christians due to their rejection of the imperial cult. And so the imperial cult, what that was, it was essentially state-sponsored emperor worship. So Domitian felt that he should be worshipped as God, and that if you refused to worship him, you were a traitor, essentially, and you were not loyal to him, and you were not loyal to the Roman Empire or Rome itself. And so we also know that Domitian, he killed and exiled Christians as well. And so this kind of fits with the fact that we know that John was exiled to the Isle of Patmos, right? And so the theory here is, well, maybe John was one of the people that was exiled by Domitian because of this reason. Because he had this issue, because the Christians refused to worship him, essentially. So then for the 65 AD date, the earlier date, that's during the reign of Nero. And what they point to make the case for this date, they point to the mark of the beast. So the mark of the beast, 666, they say that is essentially a secret code that John used to point to Emperor Nero. And they actually make a pretty good argument as to why this points to Nero. And even those that hold to the 95 AD date, they kind of agree that the mark of the beast likely does, even though they might differ on when they think the book was written, they do agree that this likely does point to Nero. And so the argument here is, well, if he's pointing to Emperor Nero, it would make more sense that he's writing this while Nero is alive rather than, however many years after he died. That's kind of the line of thinking there. The other thing that comes up, the other argument that gets made for it being written in 65 AD is that in the book of Revelation, it mentions John measuring a physical temple in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed in 70 AD by the Romans. And so it would be kind of strange to have John, to mention him measuring this temple if that temple's been destroyed, without any kind of explanation as to what temple we're talking about, right? Because it's just kind of mentioned very matter-of-fact kind of way where, it's just taken for granted that there is a temple, a physical temple in Jerusalem, right? So that's the other argument that gets made. Now, whether you take the early date or the later date, the 95 AD date or the 65 AD date, it doesn't really make much of a difference. The only time this really makes any difference is there are certain ways of looking at the book of Revelation and interpreting it where it matters. Because if the book was not written on a specific date, then the theory and the viewpoint kind of falls apart. And so that's the next part that I want to talk about, because depending on who you're talking to, they may have a completely different view of Revelation than you do, right? And so within Christianity, there's essentially four main views that have been proposed for interpreting Revelation. There's four main lenses through which Revelation is viewed. And so one of them is called the futurist view. And so this is the view that most of you are probably familiar with. It's the one that's most common nowadays. It's the traditional view of the Church of God and of evangelicals. Through the, if you go by this view, it posits that the events of Revelation are, for the most part, things that are going to take place in the future, things that haven't happened yet. We're still waiting for them to be fulfilled and for them to take place. Then you have the preterist view, which is basically the complete opposite of the futurist view. And in the preterist view, it says that the events of Revelation are not things that are going to take place in the future. Rather, they are things that have already taken place in the past. And so that's where this 65 AD date kind of comes into play, because in their view, all of these things were fulfilled by the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And so Revelation is talking about the things that took place in 70 AD when the temple was destroyed and when Jerusalem was destroyed. If you look, looking from this point of view, they believe that when the book of Revelation was written, it was still looking to the future, to things that hadn't happened yet, but these things took place very soon after the book was written, and ever since then, now we're looking at the past. We're looking at things that have already been fulfilled. Then you have the idealistic view, and in the idealistic view, they see Revelation as a timeless allegory. So they take things very figuratively, and the focus is more on like the larger themes that you see throughout the book of Revelation, which is things like the persecution of the church or good versus evil, versus focusing on things like timelines or sequence of events and like trying to line up when certain things are going to happen, right? The idealistic view doesn't get into that. It just takes the big picture view. Then you've got the historicist view. So the historicist view looks at Revelation as an ever-unfolding saga that has been taking place since the time of Christ up until our modern day. And so it takes place over this huge span of history. And so it sees us as being close to the end. So a lot of Revelation has been fulfilled already. It's taken place in the past, kind of like what the preterists would say. But there are still parts of it that are yet to come to pass, that are still to come. Okay, so I'm going to take a little bit more time and dive into each of these views a little bit more. So with the futurist view, again, this is what most people are probably familiar with, and it's also considered to be the most literal of the various views. So while this view does find symbolism in Revelation, it sticks for the most part to these things being actual events that are going to take place in some literal sequence over a short period of time, right? And many times the events themselves will be looked at as being literal. So when Revelation talks about a giant mountain being cast into the sea, someone who takes the futurist view, they would look at that and say, well, in the future, God may have an asteroid crash down to Earth or something like that, right? And so it might literally be a huge stone being cast into the sea, right? So it takes things much more literally. This was the view of the earliest writers and the earliest church fathers. And so again, as we mentioned, the early church was heavily persecuted in the Roman Empire. So they looked at Revelation as pointing to Rome as the beast power and the imperial cult that was enforcing the worship of the emperor as the false prophet. And so in a way, they saw themselves as kind of living through the persecution that was being talked about in the book of Revelation. And so the way they saw it is this, things are just going to continuously worsen over time and everything's going to come to a head. And, you're going to have all these cataclysmic events that are talked about. They're eventually going to come to pass. And then finally, Christ is going to literally return to earth and establish a literal kingdom on earth. And we're going to be reigning with Christ, right? And, nowadays, those that take the futurist view, they look at it slightly differently than that, but for the most part, that's still the general idea where everything is yet to come, right? And these things are literally going to happen. Now, the idealistic view, this became popular after the Edict of Milan, okay? And again, by this point in time, like we had talked about, the church had become more Gentile in nature and was heavily influenced by Greek philosophy. And so they had a distaste for physical things and for a literal approach to Scripture. And so they always wanted to spiritualize everything and take everything figuratively. Because of that, like we saw, a lot of them ended up just completely rejecting the book of Revelation or trying to reject the book of Revelation. They said it was too Jewish, it was too physical. But others didn't want to completely throw the book out because, again, like we said, it was very useful for defending the divinity of Christ. And so instead they kind of turned to this idealistic view that kind of, instead of throwing the book completely out, it just kind of spiritualized everything away. It kind of spiritualized away the physical parts that they had issues with. So this was kind of a middle ground for them. And so, another reason why this view kind of caught on is because, again, time passed and Christ hadn't returned. Instead of Rome being destroyed, Rome Christianized, kind of accepted Christianity. And so, eventually as you go down through history, Rome does indeed fall, but the world doesn't end. The world keeps turning. Things continue on. And so, if you're viewing things through this lens of, hey, this is it. We're living Revelation right now, and Rome is the beast, and they are the final kingdom in the book of Daniel. You're thinking that Christ is going to return at any moment, and he's going to put an end to this. He's going to destroy the Roman Empire, and and he's going to return. But instead, what you find is Rome just kind of dissolving, and so and the world keeps going. And so now they kind of take another look at Revelation. They say, well, there's a lot of symbolism in Revelation, so this wasn't actually meant to be taken literally. This is just meant to be taken symbolically, right? And so that's the approach that they started taking. Now we get to the historicist view. And so this was a view that was very popular with the Protestant reformers. So it became very popular during the Protestant Reformation. And so, the reformers, they took a look at Revelation and they said, hey, we're living this right now, right? And they took a look at various parts of Revelation and they said, the harlot that rides on the beast, right? I mean, that's crystal clear. That's obviously the Catholic Church backed by the Holy Roman Empire, And so they put these things together and they say, okay, obviously this is talking about us and our situation right now, right? So, okay, obviously now we've gotten, quite far in the book of Revelation. So what do you do with all the parts that came before that, right? And so what they started doing is they said, okay, well, obviously all of these other parts of Revelation must have already come to pass. They must have already been fulfilled. And so they start taking a look at history from the time of Christ up until their day, and they start trying to fit, Revelation to various events in history. And they start making these connections. And in some cases, they make some pretty interesting connections. And so the way they see things is that, the first few seals of the book of Revelation, that's talking about the gradual decline of the Roman Empire. And then once you get into the first few trumpets in Revelation, that's talking about the barbarian invasions, the barbarians that invaded the Roman Empire. And then, once you get down to the fifth trumpet, which is the locusts coming out of the abyss, they say, oh, that is Islam. And that's the Muslim armies that started conquering and taking over in the 7th and 8th centuries. And so they kind of map out Revelation across all these various historical periods, right? And again, that's because, they were being persecuted firsthand by the Catholic Church. You have Protestants that were being martyred for their beliefs. And so they saw themselves in this, right? They saw this taking place. The other thing that really spoke to them was you have a lot of people who are going over to America, right? There was a lot of American settlers who were Protestants. And they took a look at the book of Revelation and they see the woman in the book of Revelation who flees the persecution of the dragon and goes and is hidden in the wilderness for a period of time. And they say, okay, that's us, we're fleeing Europe, we're fleeing religious persecution in Europe, and we're going to America, and America is literally a wilderness, right? It's literally a wilderness. And so they say, this is us, and so us leaving Europe, that is our exodus. And the Atlantic Ocean is the Red Sea. And America is the Promised Land. It is, and they actually refer to America as New Jerusalem. And that might be something that I get more into on another day. It's kind of interesting. But you have all of these things kind of lining up for them that they just see very clearly, in the book of Revelation. Now, and so Exodus out of Europe and Egypt, and then like we mentioned, the seals and trumpets, they viewed that to be historical events that had already occurred. So one thing about this view, right, that really, really stuck with people was the Catholic Church as the harlot, right? That was something that it really stuck. And there were even influential members within the Catholic Church that looked at that and said, you know what, they have a point. That's obviously us. I mean, who else could it be? And so even they were like, yeah, it makes sense. And so this was extremely damaging to the Catholic Church. And so we know that eventually they launched the Counter-Reformation. And as part of that, one of the things that they needed to defend against was this accusation of the Catholic Church being the harlot of Revelation. And so that's how we get to the preterist view. So the preterist view was developed by a Spanish Jesuit named Luis Alcazar, and it was developed to defend against the accusation of the Catholic Church being the harlot of Revelation. And so what he did was he split Revelation into two parts. He said that chapters 4 through 11 is dealing with the church's persecution at the hands of the Jewish religious leaders, and it's also talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 70 AD. And then he said Revelation 12 through 19 kind of pivots and is talking about the church's persecution at the hands of pagan Rome and the imperial cult. However, he says, this is not Christianized Rome. No, all of this happened before, the Catholic Church came to be. And so therefore, the point that he kind of tries to make is that the Catholic Church could not be the harlot of Revelation, because this is all talking about events that took place before the Catholic Church even came around. Now, modern day preterism looks at this slightly differently. So they don't really break the book up into two sections the way Alcazar proposed. Rather, they look at all of Revelation as dealing with the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And like we mentioned earlier, they hold to that earlier 65 AD date for Revelation. And the main thing here is that, they're saying, hey, all of this happened in the past, and so therefore the Catholic Church cannot be the harlot. Now, I want to take a little bit more time to talk about the preterist view, because if you've never heard of this view before, it might sound kind of strange to you, because you have all of these incredible things that are talked about in the book of Revelation. And so you might wonder, how could anyone possibly look at these things and say that they happened in the past? The Revelation talks about the moon being turned to blood, for example. Obviously, that's not something that ever happened in the past. So how could anyone possibly speculate that Revelation has all been fulfilled in the past? And the historicist view kind of does this a little bit too, because they believe that quite a bit of Revelation has taken place in the past too. So this kind of goes for both the preterist view and the historicist view. So one of the things that, there's a couple of things that they will say, but one of the things that preterists one of the things that they talk about a lot is the fact that Revelation mentions over and over again throughout it that it's talking about things that are about to happen, right? These are things that are shortly, soon to come, okay? It's right around the corner. Get yourself ready, because this is coming, right? And so the argument that they make is that this doesn't make any sense if then you say, well, it's been 2,000 years and none of this has taken place, so they kind of make that argument that, how can you say that this is about to come to pass and then thousands of years pass and none of this has come to pass? So in their mind, this must have taken place shortly after it was written. Now, how do they make sense of all of these various things like the moon turning into blood, right? How do they get around that? And so the way they explain that is that, they look at these incredible things that took place that are talked about in Revelation, and they say, this is symbolic language, okay? And so they say they don't look at these things as being things that are literally going to take place, but they look at it rather as exaggerated language that represents, the persecution of the church and the destruction of Jerusalem before 70 AD. So when it talks about Christ on the clouds, they say, that's a symbol of God's judgment on Jerusalem for rejecting him. And so they will point to other scriptures where it talks about a city being destroyed, and it talks about God coming on the clouds. And they say, well, God didn't actually physically show up to that city and destroy it. Actually, an army came. God sent an army and destroyed it through an army. But that's represented as God coming on the clouds. And so that's how they'll explain something like that. And then when you see language, about the sun turning dark and the moon turning into blood and stars falling, they say, that's figurative language that's describing major events, major change in the world. And so one way they might explain that is they might say, if you were in New York when the Twin Towers fell, and you had to describe that to somebody, and you don't have any pictures and you don't have a video, and all you can use is your words to describe what that was like, how do you get that across to somebody that, this is something that you can't imagine, right? This is not something you would ever think could possibly happen, right? Maybe you would use language like this to describe that, to try to get that thought across, right? That's what they'll say. And then the horsemen of the apocalypse, they describe, they say that describes death and famine that took place during the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And there are historical accounts of that describe how horrendous that was. And so it does, in some ways you could kind of link that up, and it kind of does make sense. And so they'll say that the persecution that's mentioned in Revelation describes the Jewish persecution of the early church. According to them, the harlot represents the Jewish religious leaders. And then Babylon, depending on, there's different variations of preterism, but they see that Babylon as representing either Jerusalem or pagan Rome. So one of the big differences between these various views, one of the areas where they differ on is essentially, what is symbolic, what to take figuratively, and what to take literally. And when you do take something figuratively, because, pretty much all of the views do agree that there is symbolism in the book of Revelation. The book itself tells you that certain things are symbolic, right? So you can't say that there's no symbolism in Revelation. There is. But where they differ is not only in what they determine to be figurative, but also how figurative to take something. So how much do you disconnect yourself from the literal interpretation of the book? And how much do you kind of try to stick to the order of events and things like that? And so, that's the other thing that gets, that kind of differentiates these two views is the way they look at timelines. So some of the views, they see a literal sequence of events taking place that will happen within a literal period of time, usually a short period of time. Whereas others, they don't take that so literally. For them, it's like, okay, there's a general sequence of events here, but these periods of times might be more figurative, right? And then there's others like the idealist view that just say, they don't even bother worrying about sequence of events or trying to line things up with certain periods of time. They just say, hey, this is all allegory. We just take the major themes of Revelation, and these are just things that kind of happen throughout all of human time, right? They just happen over and over again in the world. The other thing that people differ on, and this is even within each of these views, so this is kind of a completely separate topic from those four views that we talked about, is the millennium reign and the binding of Satan. So some view that as something that is literally going to happen. Jesus Christ is going to literally come to the earth and literally reign for 1,000 years on the earth with the saints, with the church, and that Satan is going to be bound and put away. But other views see this as being just figurative. And so I'm going to talk about the different millennial views. So you've got three main millennial views, and again, these are separate from the four ways of interpreting Revelation, though some kind of go together. So you've got the premillennial view, the amillennial view, and the postmillennial view. Those are the three major views. So premillennialism, this is the one, again, that we're probably most familiar with. So this is, it typically gets paired with futurism because it's the most literal of the views. And so it's the most literal interpretation, and it's typically, like I said, it's associated with the futurist view. So in this view, and the reason why it's called premillennialism is that because it does take a literal approach to the millennium, and because it's typically paired with futurism, which sees things as taking place in a literal sequence, right? In Revelation, this is the sequence of events that takes place. Christ returns, and then you have the millennium, right? And so that's why it's called premillennialism, because it says that Christ is returning before the millennium begins. And this is the standard view of the Church of God, of fundamentalists, and the early church as well. The early church, again, like we mentioned, they had a futurist view, so they took Revelation literally, and again, they saw themselves kind of living through the book of Revelation and going through that persecution at the hands of the Jewish religious leaders and of Rome. And so they were expecting Christ to literally come and to set everything right, to destroy these kingdoms of man and to establish his kingdom on earth from Jerusalem. Then you have amillennialism, okay? So the amillennialist view is typically associated with the idealist view. And it came about the same way historically. So you have this, with the idealist view, you have this very allegorical reading of Revelation because the Roman Empire has either Christianized or has eventually fallen, and Christ hasn't physically returned. And so the question becomes, okay, what do you do with this millennium now? It didn't really happen the way we were expecting it to happen. So amillennialism, it technically means no millennium. And that's kind of confusing because if you talk to someone who views the millennium in this way, they will actually tell you that they do, in fact, believe in a millennium. And by the way, the reason why that means no millennium is because it's the same thing as so it's the prefix of a, just like an atheist. So atheist is, they believe in no God. So it's the same thing with, if you're an amillennial, you don't believe in the millennium, basically. But they will tell you that they do believe in a millennium, but they will tell you that the millennium is now, okay? And so I think that's, that's kind of where the problem comes up, because it's like, okay, well, if the millennium is now, this world right now is not exactly what I would call utopia, right? It's not heaven on earth. And so, there's a lot of problems in the world. There's evil in the world. There's persecution. And so, what kind of a millennium is this if this is the millennium, right? But they will tell you, things are not going to be perfect until Christ comes back. But this is the millennium. There's good and there's bad. And that's not going to be sorted out until Christ finally comes back. And that's why I think they get tagged with this title of amillennial, of not believing in a millennium, because essentially the millennium that they believe in is not a millennium in the way most people view the millennium, as kind of a utopia, right? Of Christ reigning on earth with the church. So, with that said, you might still wonder, well, okay, that's great, but what do you do with the fact that, Revelation says that Christ is going to reign, right? And what do you do about the fact that Revelation says that Satan's going to be bound, right? And so the way they answer that is that they say that, Satan has been bound and that Christ is reigning right now. So they say that when Christ died and resurrected, that he defeated and bound Satan at that point. And that now the Bible tells us that he is seated at the right hand of God the Father. And so they say he is actively reigning. He's reigning from heaven. However, he's not reigning in a secular sense. He's ruling over the church, and he's reigning through the church. And through the church, the gospel is being spread to the nations. And so, they will say that previously those nations, they were blinded by Satan, and they were stuck in paganism. But that's no longer the case. So Satan, still acts. He still has a presence. He still has influence in the world. But they say he's been bound in the sense that he can no longer prevent the gospel from spreading. He can no longer blind the nations, is the way that they put it. So he's not completely bound. He's just kind of limited. However, they do believe that Christ eventually does return. And so you have good and bad kind of living together up until the end. And so they see it as the wheat and the tares, the sheep and the goats, living until the end. And finally Christ returns at the end, and then he separates the sheep and the goats. The last view is postmillennialism. And postmillennialism is very similar to amillennialism in that they believe that they believe that basically the millennial period is now this current church age that we're living through. They also believe that Satan has been bound and that Christ has been reigning since his death and resurrection. And so the main thing is they will say that Christ returns after the millennium. So their understanding of this millennial period is where they differ a bit, right? So like I said, they say that the church age is the millennium. Christ is reigning in heaven through his church. But the big difference between them and the amillennial view, between the postmillennial and the amillennial view, is that they believe that ultimately the gospel will be successful and that the whole world is ultimately going to be converted. Okay? So with the amillennials, they believe that, you're going to have good and bad all the way until the end. But the postmillennials say, no, the gospel is going to be successful. We're going to convert all the nations. Everyone's going to convert to Christianity. Even the secular world will be transformed. And all you're going to be left with on the earth are people who are following God. And so that's going to usher in this utopia, this time, basically this millennial period of peace, where everything is going to be great, essentially. And so once that time period is ushered in, Christ returns, and that's why it's called postmillennialism, because he returns after the millennium. And so in their minds, this was associated with the Puritans and the later Protestants, and also it gets paired a lot with historicism. And so from their point of view, from the Puritans' point of view, they were breaking away from the church, right? The printing press had been invented. The Bible was no longer under the control of the Catholic Church. They had moved over to North America and settled in North America, and they were establishing colonies. And they thought that, this is it. The gospel is finally going to go out everywhere to all corners of the earth. There's no more stopping this. And in their minds, the only thing that was holding the world back from full conversion was simply ignorance. So once people had been educated and they had a Bible physically in their hands and could read it, in their minds, the only logical next step was conversion to Christianity. And so this is actually the kind of thinking that fueled colonization and Manifest Destiny and the sending of missionaries to various parts of the world. And it was extremely popular at one point. But then it kind of started declining. And it began declining in the 20th century. And there's a number of things that happened in the 20th century that caused this point of view to kind of start declining. One of them was the Scofield Reference Bible. So some of you may have heard of this Bible, but it was a Bible that became very popular in the U.S., and it was a Bible that had a commentary alongside it. It was kind of printed all over the place, and a lot of people had it. And their commentary on Revelation, Scofield's commentary on Revelation, was done from a premillennial viewpoint. And so this had a huge influence on the U.S. in the 20th century. The other thing that happened is that there were various scientific proposals that came about, one of them being evolutionary, the theory of evolution, that kind of caused people to kind of start falling away, right? And so there's something called they refer to it as the fundamentalist modernist divide, where you had people in the church that felt like they could no longer reconcile science and the Bible. And they felt like they had to either diminish the authority of the Bible or put it to the side completely, or they had to completely reinterpret the Bible through these various scientific views, right? And so before this point, the gospel, everywhere it went, people, it kind of seemed like people were being converted to Christianity. But now the tide has kind of turned. And you have this fierce opposition to the Bible by people who are even familiar with it, right? Where they're just outright rejecting it, even though they have it in front of them. They say, they cast it aside and they say, no, I don't believe in this, right? And so that doesn't really fit with this post-millennial view that the gospel is just going to go out and convert the whole world, because instead you start seeing the opposite, where instead it starts kind of drifting in the other direction, right? The other thing is you have World War I, right? And you have this incredible death and destruction as part of World War I. And this also doesn't fit with the post-millennial view, because in that view, again, the world is converting. And so over time, they're going to follow God. And because everyone's following God, everyone's loving their neighbor, you're not going to have war. You're going to have peace now. And then, of course, after that, you have World War II. If World War I wasn't bad enough, World War II, even worse. And then after World War II, then you get into nuclear weapons. And so rather than the world getting better and more peaceful, it's looking like the opposite. It's looking like the world's about to end or any second, right? And so that doesn't really fit with the post-millennial view. And then finally, you have the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. And this was pivotal as well, because for all this, for these hundreds and thousands of years, you had no physical Israel on the map, right? It did not exist. And so that kind of lent itself to taking some of these prophecies as being more, allegorical maybe, or symbolic. But now all of a sudden, oh, wait a second, you actually have a physical Israel on the map again. And so maybe some of these things can take place literally, right? And so that kind of shifted the thinking a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and close here, but as we've seen, there are many different people across different spans of time that have looked at Revelation and come to different conclusions about it. Influenced by the circumstances of their day, they were sometimes maybe a little short-sighted with regards to what God might or could do. A premillennial futurist might expect that God is about to come back tomorrow, not realizing that God might have other plans to extend things out for another 2,000 years potentially, and not realizing the application that Revelation might have to people living across all kinds of time periods. The idealist amillennialist view, while understanding the timeless principles that you can find in Revelation, they might be putting a limit on what God could potentially do in the future to bring about various plans literally, rather than just in a figurative sense. A preterist, while identifying how relevant Revelation was to the early church, may miss the fact that, God sometimes allows for multiple fulfillments of his word. And the postmillennial historicist, while understanding how Revelation fit with their current persecution at the hands of the Catholic Church and could be applied to various events throughout history, were maybe too intent on trying to create a specific timeline and lining things up just perfectly, and deciding exactly how God was going to work everything out. And so, I feel like while these different views have their various pros and cons, I think one thing that we absolutely have to be careful of is of becoming a prisoner of our current moment and trying to interpret Revelation specifically through the events that we ourselves are currently experiencing. While I believe that Revelation does have relevance to all Christians, regardless of when they lived, and it continues to have relevance for us today, we have seen that many have tried to interpret Revelation solely based on their specific time period. And I believe in many cases it led them to miss a lot of what Revelation is actually trying to tell us. And so, let's learn the lessons from those that preceded us, and let's try not to fall into that same trap of potentially limiting God and his word.